from sharpened sticks to stealth drones. The art of war has always evolved faster than peace. But tonight, we won't race through battlefields, we'll glide softly across centuries of shifting armor, forgotten tactics, and the silent minds behind the world's loudest conflicts. Let's gently unfold the full story of how humans learned to fight. From ancient spears to modern machines, one quiet turn at a time. If calm reflections on the rise and rhythm of war help lull you to sleep, then you're in good company, Dust. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon to explore more stories where the past whispers, not roars. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You find yourself standing on the banks of ancient Mesopotamia, watching the sun rise over the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The year is 2700 BCE, and you are witnessing something that would echo through every generation of human history that follow. The armies of Sumer and Elam face each other across a dusty battlefield, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the morning light. This moment, seemingly insignificant in the grand sweep of time, represents the birth of organized warfare as we know it. But let us step back even further to understand how humanity arrived at this pivotal moment. For thousands of years before this first recorded conflict, our ancestors had been slowly, methodically developing the tools and techniques that would make organized violence possible. In the caves of prehistoric Europe, early humans had already learned to chip flint into sharp points, to fashion wooden clubs into deadly weapons, and to hunt in coordinated groups. These skills, born from necessity and survival, would eventually be turned against other humans in the endless struggle for resources, territory, and power. The transition from hunting bands to agricultural communities created the first real need for organized military forces. As settlements grew and surplus food allowed for specialized roles within society, the concept of defending one's territory became paramount. Archaeological evidence suggests that by 2400 BCE, the first war chariots were already being used in Mesopotamian battles. Revolutionary vehicles that would dominate warfare for over a millennium. The daily life of these early warriors was far removed from the romanticized images we might conjure today. A typical Sumerian soldier would wake before dawn, not to the sound of trumpets or war horns, but to the mundane task of checking his equipment. His primary weapon was a bronze-tipped spear, carefully balanced and meticulously maintained. Bronze was expensive, precious, and required skilled craftsmen to work it properly. A damaged spear tip could mean the difference between life and death. So soldiers spent considerable time ensuring their weapons were in perfect condition. The logistics of these early armies were staggeringly complex for their time. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient armies required enormous amounts of food, water, and equipment to function. A single soldier needed approximately 4 pounds of grain per day, along with oil, dried meat, and other provisions. Multiply this by thousands of men, and you begin to understand the logistical nightmare that early military commanders faced. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles, vulnerable to attack and dependent on the cooperation of local populations. The social structure of these early military forces was surprisingly sophisticated. Rather than the chaotic mobs that we might imagine, these armies were organized into specific units, each with designated roles and responsibilities. Spearmen formed the backbone of most forces, arranged in tight formations that could present a wall of bronze points to enemy charges. Archers provided ranged support, their composite bows capable of sending arrows with deadly accuracy over distances of several hundred yards. Slingers, often recruited from pastoral communities where accuracy with stones was a necessary skill for protecting flocks, could hurl projectiles with devastating effect. The training regimen for these early warriors was grueling and comprehensive. Young men were taught not just how to use their weapons, but how to move as a unit, how to maintain discipline under pressure, and how to follow complex battlefield commands. They practiced formations repeatedly, learning to advance in unison, to wheel and turn as a single entity, and to maintain their courage when facing the terrifying prospect of charging enemy forces. Perhaps most importantly, these early armies developed the first systematic approaches to military logistics. Ancient armies required vast quantities of supplies to function effectively. Grain had to be transported from distant fields. Weapons needed constant repair and replacement, and the complex machinery of war required skilled artisans to maintain. The successful military commander was not just a warrior, but also a logistician, capable of coordinating the movement of thousands of men and tons of supplies across vast distances. The psychological aspects of early warfare were equally complex. These were not professional soldiers in the modern sense, but farmers, craftsmen, and herders who had been called to war. The trauma of battle, the fear of death, and the burden of killing other human beings weighed heavily on these early warriors. Yet they developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies to cope with these psychological challenges. Pre-battle ceremonies invoked divine protection, while post-battle rituals honored the dead and sought to purify the living from the wrecking contamination of violence. The weapons themselves tell fascinating stories of technological innovation and cultural exchange. The bronze spear, for instance, required not just skilled metalworking, but also complex trade networks to acquire the necessary tin and copper. The composite bow, with its layers of wood, horn, and sinew, represented centuries of experimentation and refinement. Even seemingly simple weapons like the sling required specialized knowledge, the proper weight and shape of projectiles, the ideal length of cords, and the techniques for achieving maximum accuracy and range. As these early armies grew in size and sophistication, they began to develop specialized roles and equipment. Engineers became essential for constructing siege works and defensive fortifications. Cavalry units, initially composed of wealthy warriors who could afford horses, provided mobility and shock power. Infantry specialists emerged, some focusing on close combat, while others specialized in ranged warfare. This division of labor made armies more effective but also more complex to command and supply. The cultural impact of these early military developments extended far beyond the battlefield. The need to equip and train armies drove innovations in metallurgy, agriculture, and administration. The requirement for coordinated movement and communication spurred developments in mathematics, engineering, and logistics. The social hierarchies that emerged from military organization would influence political structures for millennia to come. Yet for all their sophistication, these early armies operated within severe constraints. Communication was limited to visual signals, horn calls, and runners. Medical care was primitive, with wounded soldiers often left to die on the battlefield. Transportation was entirely dependent on human or animal power, limiting the speed and range of military operations. Weather, terrain, and seasonal factors played enormous roles in determining when and where battles could be fought. The question that haunts us as we witness these early developments is deceptively simple. How did societies that had recently learned to grow their own food so quickly master the art of taking it from others? The answer lies in the fundamental relationship between agricultural surplus and military power, a relationship that would shape human history for the next 5,000 years. The morning mist clings to the rolling hills of ancient Anatolia as you observe a remarkable sight. Hundreds of bronze smiths working their forges. The rhythmic hammering of metal on metal, creating an almost musical backdrop to the dawn. This is not merely craftwork, this is the military-industrial complex of the Bronze Age. And you are witnessing one of the most significant technological revolutions in the history of warfare. The mastery of bronze working, which emerged around 3000 BCE, would transform not just how wars were fought, but how entire civilizations organized. themselves around the demands of military production. The transition from copper to bronze represented far more than a simple metallurgical advancement. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was harder, more durable, and could hold a sharper edge than pure copper. But the real revolution lay in the complexity of the production process itself. Creating bronze weapons required extensive trade networks, specialized knowledge, and centralized organization factors that would fundamentally reshape the nature of political power and military organization. Consider the daily routine of a Bronze Age armorer. His day began before sunrise, checking the fires that had been burning through the night to maintain the precise temperatures needed for bronze working. The tin required for bronze production came from distant mines, often hundreds of miles away, transported by merchant networks that stretched across continents. The copper might originate from Cyprus, the tin from Cornwall or Central Asia. This international trade in military materials created some of the world's first truly global supply. Chains, the technical challenges of bronze working were staggering. The armorer had to maintain furnace temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius, carefully controlling the mixture of copper and tin to achieve the proper alloy composition. Too little tin, and the metal would be too soft. Too much, and it would become brittle. The casting process required precise molds, often made from clay or stone, shaped to create the complex curves and edges of effective weapons. A single bronze sword might require dozens of separate operations, from initial smelting to final polishing and sharpening. The logistical implications of bronze weapon production were equally complex. A typical Bronze Age army might field thousands of bronze-equipped warriors, each requiring not just weapons, but also bronze armor, tools, and ceremonial objects. The amount of metal involved was enormous. A single bronze sword contained approximately 2 pounds of bronze, while a set of armor might require 20 pounds or more. For a modest army of 5,000 men, the bronze requirements could easily exceed 100,000 pounds of finished metal. The social structure surrounding bronze weapon production was sophisticated and hierarchical. Master smiths occupied positions of enormous prestige and power, their skills being literally vital to the survival of their communities. Apprentices spent years learning the intricate techniques of metallurgy, mastering not just the physical processes but also the closely guarded secrets of alloy composition and heat treatment. The knowledge was often passed down through family lines, creating dynasties of weapon makers whose influence extended far beyond their workshops. The impact of bronze weapons on battlefield tactics was revolutionary. Bronze spears were significantly more effective than their copper predecessors, capable of penetrating leather armor and maintaining their points even after repeated thrusts. Bronze swords, unknown in the earlier Copper Age, became the weapon of choice for close combat. Their superior edge retention and durability, making them vastly superior to flint or obsidian blades. The psychological effect of bronze weapons was equally important. The gleaming metal conveyed an impression of wealth, power, and technological superiority that could intimidate enemies before battle even began. The development of bronze armor represented another quantum leap in military technology. Bronze scales, sewn onto leather backing, provided protection against both slashing and piercing attacks. The famous bronze corselet, worn by elite warriors, offered comprehensive protection for the torso while still allowing reasonable mobility. The manufacture of such armor required extraordinary skill, as each piece had to be carefully shaped to fit the human body while maintaining structural integrity. The war chariot, which first appeared in Mesopotamia around 2400 BCE, represented the culmination of Bronze Age military technology. These vehicles required not just skilled metalworking for their bronze fittings, but also advanced woodworking, leatherworking, and animal husbandry. The wheels alone were marvels of engineering, with bronze-reinforced hubs and iron-fitted rims that could withstand the tremendous stresses of high-speed warfare. The horses that pulled these chariots were carefully bred and trained, representing investments of time and resources that only the wealthiest societies could afford. The tactical employment of chariots required extensive training and coordination. Chariot warriors needed to master not just the techniques of driving their vehicles, but also the complex skills of mounted archery and spearwork. The horses had to be trained to respond to battlefield conditions, the noise of combat, the smell of blood, the chaos of charging infantry. The coordination between chariot units required sophisticated command and control systems, with signals and maneuvers that had to be practiced endlessly to be effective in the heat of battle. The maintenance requirements of Bronze Age armies were staggering. Bronze weapons required constant care to prevent corrosion and maintain their edges. The humid conditions of many ancient battlefields could cause bronze to develop a patina that weakened the metal. Skilled smiths had to accompany armies on campaign, carrying portable forges and the tools necessary to repair and maintain equipment in the field. Now, the logistics of keeping an army's bronze, weapons and fighting condition was often as challenging as feeding and housing the troops themselves. The economic implications of bronze weapon production were profound. The resources required to equip a Bronze Age army were enormous, requiring taxation systems, tribute relationships, and trade networks that spanned continents. The control of tin sources became a strategic imperative, with entire wars fought over access to these precious deposits. The wealth required to maintain bronze-equipped armies led to increased social stratification, with military elites accumulating power and resources far beyond those of ordinary citizens. The training and social organization of Bronze Age armies reflected these technological changes. Warriors were no longer simple farmers called to arms, but increasingly professional soldiers who devoted their lives to mastering the complex techniques of Bronze Age warfare. The equipment they carried represented a significant portion of their society's wealth, making them valuable assets that could not be casually risked in battle. This led to more sophisticated tactical approaches, with greater emphasis on preserving trained soldiers and their expensive equipment. The cultural impact of bronze weapons extended far beyond their military applications. The gleaming bronze sword became a symbol of power and authority, featured in royal regalia and religious ceremonies. The technical knowledge required for bronze working was often associated with divine favor or magical powers. The social status of warriors increased dramatically as their expensive equipment and specialized training made them irreplaceable assets to their communities. Yet, even as Bronze Age societies reached new heights of military sophistication, the seeds of their transformation were already being sown. The very success of bronze technology created new challenges, the increasing expense of equipping armies, the vulnerability of supply lines, and the social tensions created by extreme wealth inequality. The question that emerges from this period is both fascinating and troubling. How did societies that had created such remarkable technological achievements sustain the enormous costs of their military systems, and what happened when they could no longer bear those costs? The acrid smell of charcoal smoke fills your nostrils as you stand beside a primitive iron furnace in the hills of ancient Anatolia. Circa 1200 BCE, the smith working the bellows is sweating profusely, his muscles straining as he maintains the precise airflow needed to reach the extraordinary temperatures required for iron smelting. What you are witnessing is nothing less than the birth of a new age, the Iron Age, and with it, the democratization of warfare that would reshape human civilization forever. The transition from bronze to iron represented more than just a change in materials. It was a fundamental transformation in how societies organized themselves for war. Unlike bronze, which required tin from distant lands and specialized trade networks, iron ore was abundant and widely available. This accessibility would eventually put effective weapons within reach of ordinary farmers and craftsmen, breaking the monopoly that elites had maintained over military technology for over a millennium. The technical challenges of ironworking were initially daunting. Iron required much higher temperatures than bronze, over 1,500 degrees Celsius compared to bronze's 1,000 degrees. The early ironsmiths had to develop entirely new techniques, learning to work with a metal that behaved completely differently. From bronze, iron couldn't be cast like bronze. Instead, it had to be forged while red hot, shaped through countless hammer blows while the smith fought against time and temperature to achieve the desired form. The daily routine of an Iron Age weaponsmith was back-breaking work. The process began with the preparation of charcoal, requiring specific types of wood burned in carefully controlled conditions to achieve the pure carbon needed for high temperature. Smelting. The iron ore had to be carefully selected and prepared, often requiring crushing and washing to remove impurities. The furnace itself demanded constant attention, with the smith monitoring temperature, airflow, and fuel consumption. While working the bellows for hours at a time, the social implications of iron technology were revolutionary. For the first time in human history, effective weapons could be produced locally, without dependence on long-distance trade or elite control of resources. A village smith could produce iron spears and swords using local materials, making it possible for entire communities to arm themselves effectively. This democratization of military technology would have profound consequences for political organization and social structure. The quality of early iron weapons was inconsistent, leading to intensive experimentation with different production techniques. Some smiths discovered that adding carbon to iron created a harder, more durable material, steel. Others learned that repeated folding and hammering could eliminate impurities and create weapons of remarkable strength and sharpness. The development of quenching techniques where red-hot iron was rapidly cooled in water or oil allowed smiths to create tools and weapons that were both hard and flexible. The impact on battlefield tactics was dramatic. Iron weapons were not necessarily superior to bronze. In all respects, surly iron was often softer and more prone to corrosion than high-quality bronze. However, iron's abundance meant that armies could be equipped on a scale previously impossible. Where a Bronze Age army might field hundreds of well-equipped warriors, an Iron Age society could potentially arm thousands of soldiers with effective weapons. The logistics of iron weapon production were both simpler and more complex than bronze. Working. While iron ore was widely available, the technical expertise required was initially quite rare. Master smiths became valuable assets, traveling from community to establish new workshops and train apprentices. The knowledge of iron. Working spread slowly but inexorably, carried by wandering craftsmen, captured slaves, and migrating populations. The mass production of iron weapons required new organizational approaches. Instead of the individualized craftsmanship that characterized bronze working, iron production could be standardized and systematized. Multiple smiths could work on different components of the same weapon, with specialists focusing on specific aspects of the production process. This early form of assembly line production allowed for the creation of weapons in unprecedented quantities. The maintenance requirements of iron weapons were different from bronze. Iron was more susceptible to rust and corrosion, requiring constant care to prevent deterioration. However, iron weapons could be more easily repaired than bronze ones. A damaged iron spear could be straightened and resharpened, while a broken bronze weapon often required complete recasting. This repairability made iron weapons more practical for long campaigns and extended use. The strategic implications of iron technology were profound. Societies that mastered ironworking could equip larger armies more quickly and at lower cost than their bronze-using neighbors. The collapse of several Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE may have been partially due to their inability to adapt to the new military realities created by iron weapons. The mysterious sea peoples who ravaged the eastern Mediterranean may have owed their success to superior iron weaponry. The Cultural impact of iron weapons was equally significant. The democratization of military technology challenged existing power structures and social hierarchies. Warriors were no longer necessarily members of a wealthy elite. Ordinary farmers and craftsmen could now arm themselves effectively. This shift contributed to the rise of citizen soldier armies and the development of new forms of political organization based on broader participation in military service. The development of iron armor represented another important innovation. Iron scales and plates could be produced more cheaply than bronze equivalents, making body armor accessible to a broader range of warriors. The flexibility of iron allowed for more sophisticated armor designs, with articulated joints and complex curves that provided better protection while maintaining mobility. The famous Greek hoplite armor, with its bronze breastplate and iron fittings, represented the pinnacle of Iron Age defensive technology. The training requirements for iron-equipped armies were substantial. While the weapons themselves were more accessible, their effective use required extensive practice and discipline. The longer, more flexible iron swords demanded different fighting techniques than their bronze predecessors. The increased size of iron-equipped armies made coordination and command more challenging, requiring new approaches to military organization and leadership. The economic implications of iron technology were transformative. The lower cost of iron weapons meant that military expenditures could be reduced, freeing resources for other purposes. However, the larger armies made possible by iron technology created new logistical challenges: feeding, housing, and transporting. Thousands of soldiers required sophisticated administrative systems and substantial agricultural surpluses. The environmental impact of iron production was significant. The enormous quantities of charcoal required for smelting led to widespread deforestation in many regions. The smoke from iron furnaces created some of the first industrial pollution, while the mining of iron ore left permanent scars on the landscape. The iron industry represented humanity's first large-scale modification of the natural environment for military purposes. The technological competition between iron-using societies drove rapid innovation in weapon design and production techniques. Different regions developed distinctive approaches to ironworking, leading to weapons with unique characteristics and capabilities. The pattern-welded swords of Northern Europe, the Wootz steel of India, and the folded steel of East Asia all represented different solutions to the challenges of iron metallurgy. As iron technology matured and spread, it created the foundation for the next great phase of military development. The ability to arm large numbers of soldiers with effective weapons made possible the massive armies of the classical period, with their complex formations and sophisticated tactics. The question that emerges from this revolutionary period is both practical and profound. How did societies adapt their military organizations and strategies to take advantage of the new possibilities created by iron technology, and what were the long-term consequences of making warfare accessible to the masses? The morning sun casts long shadows across the olive groves of ancient Greece as you observe a remarkable sight: dozens of bronze-armored farmers practicing the intricate movements of the phalanx formation. These are not professional soldiers in the modern sense, but citizens of the polis landowners, who have set aside their farming tools to take up the Hopland shield and sarissa spear that define the Greek way of war. The year is 650 BCE, and you are witnessing the birth of what would become the dominant military system in Greek land warfare for the next 3 centuries. The development of the phalanx represents one of the most significant innovations in military history, not merely because of its tactical effectiveness, but because of its profound social and political implications. The phalanx was more than a military formation. It was a social institution that embodied the values and structure of the Greek city-state. To understand its impact, we must first comprehend the daily reality of life for the citizen soldiers who made it possible. The typical hoplite was a man of modest means. owning perhaps 10 to 20 acres of land that provided enough surplus to purchase the expensive panoply of armor and weapons required for phalanx service. His bronze corselet, or thorax, was often passed down through generations, carefully maintained and occasionally modified to fit its new owner. The Hopland shield, from which the hoplite derived his name, was a marvel of engineering, circular bronze and leather construction nearly 3 feet in diameter, designed not just to protect its bearer, but to overlap with the shields of his neighbors in the phalanx formation. The training regimen for these citizen soldiers was intensive and ongoing. Unlike the seasonal campaigning of earlier periods, phalanx warfare required year-round preparation. The citizens of each polis gathered regularly in the agora or on designated training grounds, practicing the precise movements and formations that would mean the difference between victory and death on the battlefield. The fundamental challenge was not individual combat skill, though that was certainly important, but the ability to move and fight as a cohesive unit. The logistics of maintaining a phalanx-based military system were staggering. Each hoplite required approximately 70 pounds of bronze and iron equipment, representing a significant investment that only the moderately wealthy could afford. The bronze alone, for a single panoply, required the import of tin from distant Cornwall or Central Asia, while the iron for spear points and sword blades came from local mines or overseas trade. The economic implications were profound. A polis's military effectiveness was directly tied to its citizens' prosperity and the stability of Mediterranean trade networks. The social structure of the phalanx reflected and reinforced the political organization of the Greek city-state. Only those wealthy enough to afford hoplite equipment could participate in the front ranks of battle, creating a direct link between economic status and military service. This connection between property ownership and military obligation would become a defining characteristic of Greek political thought, influencing everything from voting rights to civic participation. The tactical evolution of phalanx warfare was gradual but revolutionary. Early phalanxes consisted of relatively loosely organized groups of spearmen, but over time they developed into highly disciplined formations capable of complex maneuvers. The standard phalanx was typically 8 ranks deep, with each man carrying a sarissa spear of approximately 8 feet in length. The front rank fought with their spears leveled, while the rear ranks held their spears at various angles to create a bristling wall of bronze points. The psychological aspects of phalanx warfare were as important as the tactical ones. The formation required extraordinary courage and discipline, as each man's survival depended entirely on his neighbor's steadfastness. The close-packed nature of the phalanx meant that individual heroics were less important than collective cohesion. A single man breaking ranks could create a gap that would allow enemies to pour through, potentially destroying the entire formation. The daily life of a hoplite during campaign season was demanding and dangerous. The march to battle was often more arduous than the fighting itself, with fully armored men carrying their heavy equipment over mountainous terrain in the Mediterranean heat. The bronze corselet that provided protection in battle became a burden during long marches, causing heat exhaustion and fatigue that could prove fatal if the army was forced to fight immediately upon reaching the battlefield. The maintenance of hoplite equipment was a constant concern. Bronze armor required regular cleaning and polishing to prevent corrosion, while iron spear points and sword blades needed frequent sharpening and rust removal. The leather components of the panoply straps, padding, and shield facings were vulnerable to moisture and wear, requiring skilled craftsmanship to maintain and repair. Many hoplites became adept at basic metalworking and leatherworking, skills that served them well both in peace and war. The strategic implications of phalanx warfare were profound. The system favored defensive operations and carefully chosen battlefields, as the rigid formation was vulnerable to flanking attacks and difficult terrain. This tactical constraint influenced Greek military strategy for centuries, leading to the development of elaborate systems of fortification and the preference for decisive battles over prolonged campaigns. The cultural impact of the phalanx extended far beyond military affairs. The shared experience of training and fighting in the phalanx created bonds of citizenship that transcended family and economic relationships. The concept of standing shoulder to shoulder with one's neighbors in the face of mortal danger became a powerful metaphor for civic duty and social solidarity. The phalanx embodied the Greek ideal of the citizen's soldier, the man who is both farmer and warrior, politician and defender of the polis. The equipment innovations driven by phalanx warfare were remarkable. The development of the Corinthian helmet, with its distinctive bronze construction and face-covering design, provided excellent protection while allowing for the peripheral vision necessary for formation fighting. The bronze greaves that protected the lower legs were individually fitted and often decorated with intricate patterns that identified their wearer's polis or family. The aspis shield incorporated advanced metallurgy and woodworking techniques, creating a defensive weapon that was both light enough for extended use and strong enough to withstand repeated impacts. The training methods employed by different poleis varied considerably, reflecting local traditions and tactical preferences. The Spartans, famous for their military prowess, developed an intensive system of lifelong military training that began in childhood and continued throughout a man's active life. Other cities relied on seasonal training and citizen militias, creating forces that were effective but less professional than the Spartan model. The economic burden of maintaining a phalanx-based military system was substantial. Cities had to balance the cost of equipping their citizens with the need to maintain productive agriculture and trade. The seasonal nature of ancient warfare was partly driven by these economic constraints. Farmers could not afford to campaign during planting or harvest seasons, when their presence was essential for agricultural production. The political implications of phalanx warfare were equally significant. The requirement for citizen soldiers to provide their own equipment created a natural limitation on political participation. Late those wealthy enough to afford hoplite gear could fully participate in the military defense of the polis. This connection between military service and political rights would influence Greek political development for centuries, contributing to the rise of democracy in cities like Athens while reinforcing aristocratic control in others. The question that emerges from this examination of the phalanx system is both tactical and philosophical. How did a military formation that required such extraordinary coordination and discipline among amateur soldiers prove so effective? And what does its success tell us about the relationship between military organization and political structure? In ancient societies, methodical sound of picks and shovels echoes across the Roman countryside as you observe one of history's most remarkable sights. 6,000 legionaries constructing their nightly camp with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Every movement is deliberate, every action part of a larger plan that transforms raw terrain into a fortified position capable of withstanding assault. The year is 150 BCE, and you are witnessing the Roman military system at its peak of force. That would conquer the known world not through superior technology or individual heroism, but through unmatched organization, engineering, and logistics. The Roman legion of the late Republic represents the culmination of centuries of military evolution, a system that combined the best elements of various military traditions into something entirely new. Unlike the citizen soldiers of the Greek phalanx, the Roman legionary was increasingly a professional warrior, committed to 20 years of service and trained to a level of competence that had never been seen before in the ancient world. The transformation from citizen militia to professional army would prove to be one of the most significant developments in military history. The daily routine of a Roman legionary was rigorous and unforgiving. The day began before dawn with the sounding of the buccina, a bronze horn that called the soldiers to their first formation. After a brief inspection of equipment and assignment of duties, the legion would begin its march or, if in camp, commence the day's training and construction activities. The Roman military manual, as recorded by Vegetius, emphasized that soldiers should be trained in peacetime as they would fight in war, a principle that led to intensive daily drill and exercise. The equipment of a Roman legionary was standardized to a degree unknown in earlier armies. The gladius, the famous Roman short sword, was manufactured to precise specifications and distributed throughout the legions. The scutum, or rectangular shield, was constructed using advanced woodworking techniques that combined strength with relative lightness. The pilum, the Roman javelin, was designed with a soft iron shank that would bend on impact, preventing enemies from throwing it back and making it difficult to remove from shields. The organizational structure of the Roman legion was sophisticated and flexible. The basic unit was the century, consisting of 80 men under the command of a centurion. 6 centuries formed a cohort, and 10 cohorts made up a full legion. This hierarchical structure allowed for complex tactical maneuvers while maintaining clear command relationships. The century was further subdivided into tent groups of 8 men, called contubernium, who shared living quarters and formed the basic social unit of the army. The engineering capabilities of the Roman legions were extraordinary. Every legionary was trained in basic construction techniques, able to build roads, bridges, fortifications, and siege works with remarkable speed and skill. The famous Roman roads were built primarily for military purposes, enabling rapid movement of troops and supplies across the empire. The engineering tools carried by each legion included picks, shovels, axes, and surveying instruments that allowed for precise construction even in difficult terrain. The logistics of the Roman military system were unprecedented in their scale and sophistication. Each legion required approximately 18,000 pounds of grain daily, along with vast quantities of oil, wine, meat, and other provisions. The supply trains that accompanied Roman armies were massive affairs, including hundreds of wagons and pack animals, along with the civilian contractors and slaves who managed the complex system of procurement and mass distribution. The training regimen for Roman soldiers was comprehensive and ongoing. New recruits underwent intensive basic training that included weapons, drill, formation fighting, engineering skills, and physical conditioning. The Roman military emphasized practical skills over theoretical knowledge. Soldiers learned by doing, practicing the tasks they would perform in actual combat. Advanced training included siege warfare, amphibious operations, and the construction of specialized military equipment. The medical care provided to Roman soldiers was advanced for its free time. Each legion included trained medici who provided battlefield surgery and ongoing medical care. The Roman military hospitals, or valetudinaria, were among the most sophisticated medical facilities in the ancient world, with separate wards for different types of injuries and diseases. The survival rate for wounded Roman soldiers was significantly higher than in other ancient armies, contributing to the overall effectiveness of the military system. The discipline of the Roman legions was legendary, maintained through a combination of harsh punishment and generous rewards. Minor infractions were punished with extra duties or reduced rations, while serious offenses could result in flogging or even execution. However, the Roman military also provided substantial rewards for good service, including bonuses, land grants, and opportunities for advancement. The centurionate offered a path to middle-class status for soldiers of humble origin, creating powerful incentives for excellence. The tactical flexibility of the Roman legion was remarkable. Unlike the rigid phalanx formation of the Greeks, the Roman system allowed for rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. The manipular system of the Middle Republic, with its 3 lines of hastati, principes, and triarii, provided depth and flexibility that could handle various tactical situations. The later cohort system simplified command and control while maintaining tactical effectiveness. The siege warfare capabilities of the Roman legions were unmatched in the ancient world. Roman engineers developed sophisticated siege engines, including bastionages and towers that could breach even the strongest fortifications. The systematic approach to siege warfare, with its emphasis on engineering and logistics rather than simple assault, allowed Roman armies to reduce heavily fortified positions that had resisted other attackers for years. The integration of auxiliary forces into the Roman military system was another key innovation. Rather than relying solely on citizen soldiers, the Romans incorporated specialist troops from throughout the empire: Germanic cavalry, Balearic slingers, Syrian archers, and many others. These auxiliary units provided capabilities that complemented the heavy infantry of the legions, creating a combined arms force of unprecedented effectiveness. The administrative aspects of the Roman military were equally impressive. Detailed records were maintained for every aspect of military operations, from individual soldier records to supply inventories and campaign expenses. The Roman military bureaucracy, though often criticized for its complexity, enabled the coordination of military operations across vast distances and extended periods of time. The cultural impact of the Roman military system extended far beyond warfare. The values of discipline, organization, and engineering excellence that characterized the legions influenced Roman society as a whole. The concept of virtues, or military virtue, became a defining characteristic of Roman identity, influencing everything from political rhetoric to architectural design. The economic implications of maintaining the Roman military system were staggering. At its peak, the Roman Empire supported over 30 legions, representing approximately 150,000 professional soldiers, plus an equal number of auxiliaries. The cost of maintaining this force consumed a significant portion of the empire's resources, requiring sophisticated taxation and financial administration to sustain. The question that emerges from this examination of the Roman military system is both practical and profound. How did a relatively small Italian city-state develop and maintain a military organization capable of conquering and governing an empire spanning 3 continents? And what were the ultimate costs of this unprecedented military achievement? The answer lies not in any single innovation, but in the systematic approach that the Romans brought to every aspect of military organization. Where other armies relied on individual heroism or technological superiority, the Romans created a machina, vast, complex, but remarkably efficient system that could absorb losses, adapt to new challenges, and continue operating across vast distances and extended periods of time. The recruitment system of the Roman military was both its greatest strength and its eventual weakness. Initially based on citizen soldiers who served for limited periods, the system evolved toward longer terms of service and eventually full professionalization. This change created armies of unmatched competence, but also placed enormous financial burdens on the state. The transformation from citizen militia to professional army would ultimately contribute to the fall of the Republic, as loyalty shifted from the state to individual commanders who could provide the land and bonuses that soldiers required. The technological innovations driven by Roman military needs were remarkable. The Romans were not great inventors in the modern sense, but they were superb engineers who could take existing technologies and improve them for military use. The Roman road system, the most advanced transportation network in the ancient world, existed primarily to serve military needs. The aqueducts that supplied Roman cities were often built using techniques developed for military engineering. The concrete used in Roman construction was perfected for military fortifications before being adapted for civilian use. The training facilities developed by the Romans were sophisticated and comprehensive. The Campus Martis in Rome served as a vast training ground where soldiers practiced formation fighting, siege warfare, and engineering skills. Regional training centers throughout the empire provided standardized instruction that ensured consistent quality across all legions. The wooden weapons used in training were actually heavier than their metal counterparts, ensuring that soldiers would find their actual equipment. It's easier to handle in combat. The medical innovations of the Roman military were equally impressive. Roman military surgeons developed advanced techniques for battlefield surgery, including the use of opium for pain relief and sophisticated instruments for extracting arrows and spear points. The Roman military's emphasis on hygiene and sanitation reflected in the careful design of military camps and hospitals, contributed significantly to the health and effectiveness of their forces. The intelligence and reconnaissance capabilities of the Roman military were extensive. The Romans maintained networks of spies and informants throughout their territories, providing detailed information about enemy movements and intentions. The Roman military's mapping and surveying capabilities were unmatched, allowing for precise planning of campaigns and the construction of fortifications in optimal locations. The question that haunts us as we consider the Roman military system is whether such organizational perfection was worth the enormous costs it imposed. The Roman military machine consumed vast resources, required constant expansion to pay for itself, and ultimately contributed to the social and economic problems that led to the empire's decline. Yet for nearly 5 centuries, it provided a level of security and stability that would not be seen again in Europe. For over 1,000 years, the torchlight flickers across the weathered faces of Germanic warriors as they gather in the forest clearing, their long spears and round shields silhouetted against the dying flames. Across the narrow valley, the ordered ranks of a Roman legion maintain their disciplined formation. But something has changed. The year is 378 CE, and you are witnessing the aftermath of Adrianople battle that would mark the beginning of the end for the classical military system that had dominated warfare for over a millennium. The decline of classical warfare was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation that reflected deeper changes in society, economy, and political organization. The professional armies that had conquered the Mediterranean world were becoming increasingly expensive to maintain, while the societies that supported them were facing new challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable. The barbarian invasions that marked the end of the Western Roman Empire were as much a symptom of these deeper problems as their cause. The daily life of a late Roman soldier was vastly different from that of his predecessors during the height of the empire. By the 4th century CE, the Roman military had become heavily dependent on foreign recruits, many of whom were drawn from the very Germanic tribes that the empire was fighting. These foederati, or federated troops, brought their own military traditions and loyalties, gradually transforming the character of the Roman military from within. The economic burden of maintaining the late Roman military was staggering. The empire's financial resources were stretched to the breaking point by the need to support not just the legions, but also an increasingly complex bureaucracy and a growing number of barbarian allies who required substantial payments for their services. The debasement of Roman currency, driven by military expenses, created inflation that further undermined the empire's ability to fund its military needs. The technological changes that characterized the late classical period were subtle but significant. The increasing use of cavalry, influenced by contact with steppe peoples and Germanic tribes, gradually reduced the importance of the traditional infantry legion. The development of heavier armor and longer weapons reflected the changing nature of warfare, as pitched battles gave way to raids, ambushes, and sieges that favored different tactical approaches. The administrative challenges facing the late Roman military were immense. The empire had grown too large and complex to be governed effectively by traditional methods. Communication, delays, corruption, and the division of authority between multiple emperors and their subordinates created a system that was increasingly incapable of responding effectively to military threats. The famous efficiency of the Roman military machine was gradually eroded by bureaucratic dysfunction and political instability. The social changes that accompanied the decline of classical warfare were equally profound. The citizen-soldier ideal that had characterized both Greek and Roman military systems was gradually replaced by a more feudal model based on personal loyalty and land tenure. The barbarian allies who served alongside Roman troops brought their own social structures and military traditions, creating a hybrid system that was neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian. The cultural impact of these changes was enormous. The classical ideal of disciplined professional military service gave way to a more individualistic approach that emphasized personal heroism and loyalty to specific leaders rather than abstract concepts of state or empire. The military virtues that had been central to classical civilization discipline, organization, and engineering excellence were gradually replaced by different values that reflected the realities of a more fragmented and localized world. The training methods employed by late classical armies reflected these broader changes. The systematic drill and engineering education that had characterized Roman military training was gradually simplified and localized. Different units developed their own traditions and methods, creating a military force that was increasingly diverse and difficult to coordinate. The standardization that had been a hallmark of classical military organization was lost as central authority weakened. The equipment used by late classical armies showed similar trends toward diversification and localization. The standardized weapons and armor that had characterized the Roman legions were gradually replaced by more varied equipment that reflected local traditions and resource availability. The sophisticated supply systems that had supported classical armies were replaced by more improvised arrangements that were often inadequate for extended campaigns. The strategic concepts that had guided classical warfare were also changing. The emphasis on decisive battles and territorial conquests that had characterized earlier periods gave way to a more defensive approach, focused on protecting key population centers and trade routes. The grand strategic vision that had enabled classical empires to conquer vast territories was replaced by more limited objectives that reflected the reduced resources and ambitions of declining states. The engineering capabilities that had been such a distinctive feature of classical armies were gradually lost as the educational systems that had produced skilled military engineers collapsed. The great roads, fortifications, and siege engines that had been symbols of classical military power fell into disrepair as the knowledge and resources needed to maintain them became unavailable. The medical care provided to soldiers also declined, as the sophisticated military hospitals of the classical period were closed or converted to other uses. The advanced surgical techniques and medical knowledge that had characterized classical military medicine were gradually lost, contributing to higher casualty rates and reduced military effectiveness. The intelligence and reconnaissance capabilities that had supported classical military operations were similarly degraded. The extensive networks of spies and informants that had provided detailed information about enemy movements and intentions were disrupted by political instability and economic decline. The mapping and surveying capabilities that had enabled precise military planning were lost as the educational institutions that had trained military engineers were closed or converted to other purposes. The question that emerges from this examination of the decline of classical warfare is both historical and philosophical. Was the collapse of the classical military system inevitable? Or could different choices have preserved the achievements of centuries of military development? The answer seems to lie in the fundamental tension between the resources required to maintain sophisticated military organizations and the political and economic structures needed to generate those resources. The transformation of classical warfare into medieval military systems was not simply a matter of technological change, but reflected broader shifts in social organization, economic structure, and political authority. The feudal military systems that emerged from the collapse of classical civilization were adapted to the realities of a more localized and fragmented world. But they also represented a significant loss of the organizational and engineering capabilities that had characterized classical military achievement. The the legacy of classical warfare would persist in various forms. Throughout the medieval period and beyond, the military engineering traditions of Rome would influence fortress design for centuries. While the organizational principles of the Roman army would be studied and emulated by military leaders throughout history. The ideal of disciplined, professional. Military service would eventually be revived during the Renaissance and would become a defining characteristic of modern military organizations, yet the question that haunts us as we consider this transformation is whether the achievements of classical military civilization were worth the enormous costs they imposed on the societies that created them. The Roman Empire at its height provided unprecedented security and stability. But the military system that made this possible ultimately consumed the resources and social cohesion that it was designed to protect. The decline of classical warfare marked the end of an era, but it also opened the door to new forms of military organization that would shape the future of human conflict in ways that the classical world could never have imagined. The morning mist clings to the massive stone walls of a newly constructed castle as you observe the final stages of a construction project that has consumed 7 years. Thousands of tons of stone and the labor of hundreds of skilled craftsmen. The year is 1180 CE, and you are witnessing the culmination of what historians would later call the Castle Revolution, a transformation in military architecture that would define European warfare for the next 3 centuries. The massive towers, thick walls, and intricate defensive systems before you represent not just military engineering, but a complete reimagining of how societies organize themselves for both war and peace. The development of medieval fortification represented a fundamental shift in military thinking, where classical armies had emphasized mobility, offensive action, and decisive battles. Medieval military science focused increasingly on defensive systems that could withstand prolonged sieges. This change reflected broader transformations in European society, the decline of centralized authority, the rise of localized power centers, and the development of new forms of social organization based on land tenure and personal loyalty. The daily life of a medieval castle during peacetime was a complex blend of military preparation and civilian administration. The constable, or military commander, oversaw not just the training of the garrison, but also the maintenance of the castle's defensive systems. The massive walls required constant repair, as moisture, frost, and simple weathering could create vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. The maintenance of weapons, armor, and siege engines was an ongoing process that required skilled craftsmen and substantial resources. The construction process of a medieval castle was an engineering marvel that rivaled the great building projects of the classical world. The selection of the site involved careful consideration of natural defensive features, water sources, and strategic importance. The foundation work required sophisticated understanding of soil conditions and structural engineering, as the massive walls and towers had to be supported by foundations that could withstand both the weight of the structure and the impact of siege engines. The stonemasonry techniques employed in castle construction were extraordinary. Master masons developed sophisticated methods for cutting, shaping, and fitting stones that created walls of remarkable strength and durability. The mortar used in castle construction was carefully formulated to provide maximum strength and weather resistance. The architectural innovations of medieval fortress builders, including the development of the concentric castle design, the refinement of tower construction, and the creation of sophisticated gate systems, represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and experimentation. The siege weapons that defined medieval warfare were marvels of engineering that required sophisticated understanding of physics, mathematics, and material science. The trebuchet, with its massive counterweight system, could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds over distances of several hundred yards. The construction of these engines required skilled craftsmen who understood the principles of leverage, the properties of different woods, and the techniques of rope and metalworking. The social organization of medieval military systems was closely tied to the feudal structure of European society. The castle was not just a military installation, but the center of a complex economic and social system. The lord of the castle held land from a higher authority in exchange for military service, while granting portions of that land to his own vassals in return for their military obligations. This system created a hierarchy of military service that extended from the highest nobility to the lowest-ranking knights and men at arms. The training of medieval warriors was a lifelong process that began in childhood and continued throughout a man's active career. The young nobleman destined for knighthood began his education as a page in another lord's household, learning the basics of horsemanship, weapons handling, and military courtesy. As a squire, he would serve an experienced knight, gaining practical experience in the maintenance of equipment and the realities of combat. The formal ceremony of knighthood marked not just military achievement, but entrance into a social and cultural elite with its own codes of conduct and systems of values. The equipment of medieval warriors was both sophisticated and expensive. The knight's armor evolved from simple mail shirts to complex systems of plate and chain that provided comprehensive equiche protection, while allowing reasonable mobility. The development of the great helm, the refinement of shield design, and the creation of specialized weapons for different combat situations all reflected centuries of innovation and experimentation. The maintenance of this equipment required skilled armorers and substantial financial resources. The logistics of medieval warfare were complex and challenging. Unlike the centralized supply systems of classical armies, medieval military forces relied on more improvised arrangements that often proved inadequate for extended campaigns. The feudal system of military service, with its emphasis on short-term obligations and local loyalties, made it difficult to maintain large armies in the field for extended periods. The transportation of supplies, siege engines, and equipment over the poor roads of medieval Europe required enormous resources and careful planning. The tactical evolution of medieval warfare reflected the interaction between offensive and defensive innovations. The development of more effective siege engines drove improvements in castle design, while innovations in fortification prompted new approaches to siege warfare. The gradual improvement in crossbow technology, the development of more sophisticated armor, and the refinement of cavalry tactics all represented responses to changing military realities. The economic implications of medieval military systems were profound. The construction and maintenance of castles required enormous resources that often strained the finances of even wealthy lords. The cost of equipping knights and maintaining their horses, weapons, and armor was substantial. The economic burden of military service created incentives for the development of new forms of military organization and the gradual professionalization of military forces. The cultural impact of medieval military systems extended far beyond warfare itself. The ideal of knighthood, with its emphasis on honor, loyalty, and martial prowess, became a defining characteristic of European culture. The literature of chivalry, the development of heraldry, and the creation of military orders all reflected the central importance of military service in medieval society. The castle became a symbol of power and authority that influenced architecture, art, and social organization for centuries. The technological innovations driven by medieval military needs were remarkable. The development of the stirrup, which provided cavalry with a stable platform for using lances and swords, revolutionized mounted warfare. The improvement of metallurgy, driven by the need for better weapons and armor, contributed to advances. In other areas of technology, the engineering techniques developed for castle construction were applied to other building projects, including cathedrals, bridges, and urban fortifications. The environmental impact of medieval warfare was significant. The construction of castles required enormous quantities of stone, timber, and other materials that often had to be transported over long distances. The maintenance of large numbers of war horses required substantial amounts of fodder and grazing land. The destruction caused by siege warfare and military campaigns had lasting effects on the landscape and agricultural productivity of medieval Europe. The medical care provided to medieval warriors was primitive by modern standards, but represented significant advances over earlier periods. The military orders, particularly the Knights Hospitaller, developed sophisticated medical facilities and techniques for treating battlefield injuries. The understanding of anatomy and surgery, driven partly by military needs, advanced considerably. During the medieval period, the question that emerges from this examination of medieval military systems is both practical and philosophical. How did the defensive emphasis of medieval warfare influence the development of European society, and what were the long-term consequences of organizing military systems around fortification rather than mobility? The answer lies in the fundamental relationship between military technology and social organization. Relationship that would be dramatically transformed by the next great revolution in military affairs. The rhythmic thudding of a massive trebuchet punctuates the morning air as you observe one of medieval warfare's most methodical spectacles, a siege in progress. The year is 1304, and you are witnessing the systematic reduction of a Scottish castle by Edward I's forces, a process that exemplifies the patient engineering-focused approach that characterized medieval warfare. Before you stretch as a vast encampment of besiegers, their siege lines bristling with wooden towers, catapults, and the massive timber frameworks of counterweight trebuchets that will, stone by stone, attempt to breach walls that have stood for over a century. The art of siege warfare in the medieval period represented perhaps the most sophisticated application of engineering principles in the pre-gunpowder era. Unlike the mobile campaigns of classical antiquity, medieval siege warfare was characterized by patience, methodical preparation, and the careful application of mechanical principles to the problem of breaching fortifications. The siege was not simply a military operation, but a complex engineering project that required extensive planning, skilled craftsmen, and substantial resources. The daily routine of a medieval siege was marked by a grinding predictability that could extend for months or even years. The besiegers would establish their camps at a safe distance from the castle walls, then begin the systematic process of constructing their siege engines and defensive works. The defenders, meanwhile, would prepare for a long ordeal, rationing supplies, repairing damage, and maintaining the morale of their garrison. The psychological aspects of siege warfare were often as important as the physical ones, as both sides engaged in a contest of wills that could be decided by hunger, disease, or simple exhaustion. The construction of medieval siege engines was a marvel of engineering that required sophisticated understanding of mechanical principles. The trebuchet, the most powerful of these weapons, operated on the principle of the counterweight lever, using a massive weight, often several tons of stone or metal, to launch projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds. The construction of a large trebuchet required skilled carpenters who understood the properties of different woods, the principles of leverage, and the techniques of joinery that could withstand the tremendous stresses generated by the machines. Operation. The engineering challenges of trebuchet construction were formidable. The frame had to be strong enough to support the massive counterweight, while flexible enough to absorb the shock of its rapid movement. The throwing arm required precise calculation of length, weight, and balance to achieve maximum range and accuracy. The release mechanism had to be precisely timed to achieve the optimal trajectory for the projectile. The adjustment of these variables required both theoretical understanding and practical experience that was acquired through years of experimentation. The ammunition used by medieval siege engines was carefully selected for specific purposes. Heavy stones were used to batter down walls and towers, while lighter projectiles filled with incendiary materials were designed to start fires within the castle. Biological warfare was not unknown. Diseased animal carcasses were sometimes launched over walls to spread pestilence among the defenders. The psychological impact of these weapons was often as important as their physical effects, as the constant bombardment could demoralize defenders and encourage surrender. The defensive innovations developed in response to siege warfare were equally sophisticated. Castle designers developed complex systems of multiple walls, towers, and gates that forced attackers to overcome several lines of defense before reaching the main keep. The concentric castle design, with its inner and outer walls, created a defensive system that could continue to function even after the outer defenses were breached. The development of murder holes, portcullises, and other defensive features made the simple act of entering a castle through its gates a hazardous undertaking. The logistics of medieval siege warfare were staggering. A major siege might require thousands of skilled craftsmen, hundreds of tons of timber and stone, and enormous quantities of food and supplies to sustain the besieging army. The transportation of heavy siege engines over medieval roads was a major undertaking that required careful planning and substantial resources. Many siege towers and trebuchets were constructed on site, using timber and other materials that had to be transported to the siege location. The role of mining in medieval siege warfare was crucial but often overlooked. Sappers would dig tunnels beneath castle walls, supporting the excavation with timber props that were then set on fire to collapse the tunnel and bring down the wall above. This technique required sophisticated understanding of soil conditions, structural engineering, and the properties of different building materials. The defenders would countermine, attempting to intercept the attackers' tunnels and prevent the collapse of their fortifications. The social organization of medieval siege warfare reflected the broader feudal structure of European society. The lord conducting the siege was responsible for coordinating the efforts of his vassals, each of whom brought their own men and resources to the effort. The division of labor was complex, with different groups responsible for operating siege engines, constructing defensive works, and maintaining the supply lines that sustained the besieging army. The technical specialists, engineers, miners, and master craftsmen occupied positions of particular importance and were often recruited from considerable distances. The economic costs of medieval siege warfare were enormous. The construction and operation of siege engines required skilled labor and expensive materials. The maintenance of large armies in the field for extended periods consumed vast quantities of food, equipment, and other supplies. The opportunity costs were equally significant, as the men engaged in siege warfare were not available for agricultural work or other productive activities. These economic pressures often influenced the conduct of sieges, as neither side could afford to sustain a prolonged effort indefinitely. The technological innovations driven by siege warfare were remarkable. The development of more effective siege engines drove improvements in mechanical engineering, while the need for better defensive systems led to advances in architecture and construction techniques. The understanding of physics and mathematics required for the design of siege engines contributed to broader scientific developments. The metallurgical knowledge required for the construction of siege engine components advanced the understanding of materials science. The cultural impact of siege warfare extended far beyond its immediate military applications. The siege became a common theme in medieval literature, art, and music, representing the ultimate test of knightly virtue and feudal loyalty. The technical knowledge required for siege warfare was transmitted through written manuals and oral traditions that influenced military engineering for centuries. The social relationships forged during long sieges often had lasting political consequences. The medical challenges of siege warfare were severe. The confined conditions within besieged castles created ideal conditions for the spread of disease, while the psychological stress of prolonged siege could have devastating effects on both defenders and attackers. The development of military medicine during the medieval period was driven partly by the need to treat the injuries and illnesses associated with siege warfare. The understanding of nutrition and sanitation, crucial for maintaining health during long sieges, advanced considerably during this period. The environmental consequences of medieval siege warfare were significant. The construction of siege engines required enormous quantities of timber, often leading to deforestation in the surrounding area. The destruction of agricultural land and infrastructure during sieges had lasting effects on local economies and population patterns. The abandoned siege works that remained after successful sieges often became permanent features of the landscape. The question that emerges from this examination of medieval siege: warfare is both technical and strategic. How did the methodical, engineering-focused approach of medieval siege warfare influence the broader development of military technology? And what were the implications of organizing military systems around the patient reduction of fortifications rather than the rapid decision of field battles? The answer would prove to be crucial as European warfare entered a new phase of technological development that would transform both siege and field warfare beyond recognition. The acrid smell of sulfur and saltpeter fills the air as you witness a moment that will forever change the nature of warfare. The year is 1453, and you stand before the massive walls of Constantinople, watching as Hungarian engineer Orban's great bronze cannons methodically reduce fortifications that have stood for over 1,000 years. Each thunderous discharge sends a stone ball weighing over 600 pounds, smashing into walls that were designed to withstand the most powerful siege engines of the medieval world. What you are witnessing is not just the fall of the Byzantine Empire, but the death of an entire era of military architecture and the birth of a new age of warfare. The introduction of gunpowder weapons, too. European warfare represents one of the most profound transformations in military history. The technology that originated in China during the 9th century had traveled slowly westward along the Silk Road, arriving in Europe during the 13th century. However, it was not until the 14th and 15th centuries that European military engineers began to exploit the full potential of this revolutionary technology, creating weapons that would render obsolete the defensive systems that had dominated medieval warfare for centuries. The daily life of a medieval gunner was dangerous, demanding, and highly skilled. The preparation of gunpowder required precise measurements of sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal, combined in specific proportions that varied depending on the intended use. Early gunpowder manufacture was a hazardous process, as the materials were highly volatile and the mixing process could easily result in accidental explosions. The skilled powder makers who mastered these techniques were highly valued and often closely guarded secrets of their employers. The evolution of cannon technology was rapid and dramatic. The earliest cannons were simple tubes of wrought iron, reinforced with bands and mounted on crude wooden frames. These primitive weapons were as dangerous to their operators as to their targets, with frequent explosions and misfires that could kill or maim the gunners. However, improvements in metallurgy and engineering quickly produced more reliable and powerful weapons. The development of bronze casting techniques allowed for the creation of cannons that were both stronger and more accurate than their iron predecessors. The tactical implications of gunpowder weapons were revolutionary. The high walls and massive towers that had been the hallmarks of medieval fortification were suddenly vulnerable to weapons that could batter them down from a distance. The psychological impact was equally significant. The thunderous roar of cannon fire and the spectacular destruction they could cause had a demoralizing effect on defenders that was often as important as their physical capabilities. The very foundations of medieval military thinking were challenged by weapons that could breach any fortification given sufficient time and ammunition. The logistics of gunpowder warfare were complex and demanding. Unlike traditional siege engines, which could be constructed on-site using local materials, Cannons required specialized manufacturing facilities and skilled metalworkers. The transportation of heavy cannons over medieval roads was a major undertaking that required specially designed wagons and teams of draft animals. The supply of gunpowder, with its requirement for exotic materials like saltpeter, created new logistical challenges that military commanders had to master. The social implications of gunpowder warfare were profound. The expensive and technically demanding nature of cannon warfare meant that only wealthy rulers could afford to maintain effective artillery forces. This technological advantage contributed to the centralization of political power, as local lords found their castle fortifications increasingly obsolete and their military importance diminished. The rise of royal armies equipped with cannons marked the beginning of the end for the feudal military system that had dominated Europe for centuries. The engineering challenges of early cannon warfare were formidable. The gunpowder revolution C1300-1650 generated by gunpowder. Explosions required the development of new testing methods and mathematical calculations. The design of cannon barrels had to account for the tremendous stresses generated by the expanding gases, leading to innovations in metallurgy and structural engineering. The development of standardized calibers and ammunition types represented early attempts at 2.8 industrial standardization that would become crucial for military effectiveness. The training requirements for gunpowder warfare were extensive and specialized. Gunners had to master not only the technical aspects of loading and firing their weapons, but also the complex calculations required for accurate targeting. The understanding of ballistics, trajectory, and range estimation required mathematical knowledge that was rare in medieval society. The development of gunnery schools and training manuals represented early attempts at technical education that would influence military and civilian learning for centuries. The economic impact of gunpowder warfare was enormous. The cost of manufacturing cannons and maintaining supplies of gunpowder created new financial pressures on medieval rulers. The traditional feudal system of military service, based on land, tenure, and personal obligations, was increasingly supplemented by hired specialists who demanded payment in cash rather than land. This monetization of warfare contributed to the development of more sophisticated financial systems and the growth of merchant classes who profited from military contracts. The defensive innovations prompted by gunpowder warfare were remarkable. Military engineers developed new fortification systems that could withstand cannon fire through the use of lower, thicker walls and angled bastions that could deflect projectiles. The Trace Italian, or Star Fort design, represented a complete reimagining of defensive architecture that would dominate military engineering for the next 3 centuries. These new fortifications required enormous resources to construct and maintain, further contributing to the centralization of military power. The cultural impact of gunpowder warfare extended far beyond its immediate military applications. The thunderous noise and spectacular effects of cannon fire captured the imagination of contemporary observers, who often described artillery in terms of divine intervention or supernatural power. The technical knowledge required for gunpowder warfare contributed to broader scientific developments, as the understanding of chemistry, physics, and mathematics advanced to meet military needs. The international implications of gunpowder warfare were significant. The technology spread rapidly across Europe and beyond, but different regions developed distinctive approaches to artillery warfare. The Turkish cannons that breached the walls of Constantinople represented one tradition, while the French artillery that dominated the Italian wars represented another. The competition between different military systems drove rapid innovation and the international transfer of military technology. The environmental consequences of gunpowder warfare were notable. The mining of saltpeter, essential for gunpowder production, required extensive excavation and processing that altered landscapes and created new industrial centers. The deforestation caused by the need for charcoal production had lasting effects on European forests. The lead pollution from cannonballs and the sulfur contamination from gunpowder. Production created some of the earliest examples of industrial environmental damage. The medical challenges of gunpowder warfare were severe. The wounds caused by cannon fire were often more severe than those inflicted by traditional weapons, requiring new approaches to battlefield surgery and medical care. The psychological trauma associated with the noise and destruction of artillery bombardment created new forms of combat stress that military physicians had to learn to treat. The development of military medicine during this period was driven partly by the need to address the specific challenges of gunpowder warfare. The question that emerges from this examination of gunpowder. Warfare is both technological and philosophical. How did the introduction of chemical energy to warfare transform not just military technology, but the entire organization of European society? And what were the long-term consequences of creating weapons that could destroy the physical foundations of medieval civilization? The answer would prove to be crucial as European warfare entered the modern era. With its emphasis on technological innovation, centralized state power, and the systematic application of scientific knowledge to military problems. The rhythmic hammering of steam-powered machinery echoes through the vast halls of the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, as you observe a sight that would have been unimaginable to previous generations of warriors. The year is 1853, and you are witnessing the birth of modern military production and assembly line of skilled workers transforming raw iron and steel into precisely manufactured rifles at a rate that dwarfs anything achieved in previous centuries. Each weapon is identical to the last, each component interchangeable, each process standardized to achieve maximum efficiency. This is no longer the craft workshop of medieval armorers, but the industrial heart of a new kind of warfare. The Industrial Revolution's impact on military technology was profound and multifaceted, transforming not just how weapons were made, but how armies were organized, supplied, and deployed. The steam engine, the factory system, and the development of precision manufacturing created possibilities for military production that were revolutionary in their scope and implications. The ability to produce weapons, ammunition, and equipment in unprecedented quantities would fundamentally alter the nature of warfare itself. The daily routine of a worker in an industrial armaments factory was governed by the relentless rhythm of mechanized production. The skilled craftsmen who had once shaped individual weapons through years of apprenticeship were replaced by specialized workers who performed specific tasks in a coordinated production process. The gunsmith who had once created an entire rifle from raw materials was superseded by teams of workers, each responsible for a particular component or operation. This division of labor dramatically increased productivity while reducing the skill requirements for individual workers. The technological innovations that drove industrial military production were remarkable. The development of precision machine tools allowed for the creation of components with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The steam-powered machinery that drove factory production could operate continuously, increasing output far beyond what was possible with human or animal power. The development of new metallurgical techniques, including the Bessemer process for steel production, provided materials that were stronger, lighter, and more consistent than anything available in previous eras. The standardization that characterized industrial military production was revolutionary. Previous weapons had been individually crafted, with each piece unique in its dimensions and characteristics. Industrial production created weapons with interchangeable parts, allowing for simplified maintenance, repair, and logistics. A soldier whose rifle was damaged in battle could potentially repair it using components from any other weapon of the same type. This interchangeability extended to ammunition, equipment, and even larger systems like artillery pieces. The economic implications of industrial military production were staggering. The capital investment required to establish modern armaments factories was enormous, but the potential returns were equally great. The ability to produce weapons in large quantities reduced the unit cost dramatically, making it possible to equip much larger armies than had been feasible in previous eras. However, this also created new economic vulnerabilities, as the fixed costs of industrial production required continuous operation to be profitable. The social organization of industrial military production was complex and hierarchical. The skilled craftsmen who had dominated weapon production in previous eras were gradually replaced by a new class of industrial workers, who possessed different skills and worked under different conditions. The management of these large-scale production facilities required new forms of organization and control that would influence industrial development far beyond the military sphere. The emergence of industrial engineering as a discipline was driven partly by the need to optimize military production. The quality control systems developed for industrial military production were unprecedented. The need to ensure that weapons and ammunition would function reliably under combat conditions drove the development of sophisticated testing and inspection procedures. Statistical methods were applied to production processes to identify and correct defects before they could reach the battlefield. The concept of scientific management, with its emphasis on measurement and optimization, was pioneered in military production facilities. The logistics of industrial military production created new challenges and opportunities. The concentration of production in large factories required the development of transportation systems capable of moving raw materials to the factories and finished products to the armies that would use them. The railroad networks that expanded rapidly during the 19th century were often built with military considerations in mind, as the ability to move troops and supplies quickly over long distances became crucial for military success. The labor force required for industrial military production was enormous and diverse. Skilled machinists, engineers, and technicians worked alongside semi-skilled operators and unskilled laborers to create complex production systems. The training of this workforce required new forms of technical education that would influence educational development throughout the industrial world. The specialized knowledge required for advanced weapons production became a strategic resource that nations sought to develop and protect. The environmental consequences of industrial military production were significant. The mining operations required to supply raw materials for weapons production consumed vast quantities of natural resources and altered landscapes permanently. The coal burned to power steam engines created air pollution on an unprecedented scale. The chemical processes used in munitions production generated toxic wastes that contaminated soil and water. The Industrial Revolution's military applications marked humanity's first large-scale industrial impact on the environment. He donned air as you watched thousands of uniformed soldiers disembarking from a seemingly endless train of carriages. The year is 1861, and you are witnessing the mobilization of the Union Army during the American Civil War conflict that would demonstrate the terrifying potential of industrial technology applied to warfare. The railroad that has brought these troops to the front represents just one element of a revolution in military affairs that encompasses everything from rifle manufacturing to medical care, from telegraph communications to mass-produced artillery. Shell's the transformation of weaponry during the industrial age was dramatic and comprehensive. The rifled musket, with its precision-manufactured barrel and standardized ammunition, was vastly superior to the smoothbore weapons of previous eras. The development of percussion caps and later cartridge ammunition made firearms more reliable and faster to load. The industrial production of these weapons meant that entire armies could be equipped with identical, high-quality firearms for the first time in military history. The engineering capabilities that emerged from industrial development transformed military construction and fortification. The mass production of tools and materials made possible the rapid construction of defensive works, roads, and bridges that would have required much longer using traditional methods. The development of explosives for mining and construction was quickly adapted for military use, creating new possibilities for both siege warfare and defensive demolitions. The organizational innovations required to manage industrial-age armies were significant. The larger size of these forces required new forms of military organization and administration. The complexity of coordinating industrial production, transportation, and supply required new forms of staff, organization, and planning. The development of military academies and professional officer education reflected the increased technical complexity of modern warfare. The financial implications of industrial warfare were enormous. The cost of equipping and maintaining industrial-age armies far exceeded anything in previous military history. The need to fund large-scale military production drove the development of new forms of government finance, including the widespread use of government bonds and paper currency. The economic burden of modern warfare became a crucial factor in determining military outcomes. The social consequences of industrial warfare were profound. The ability to produce weapons and equipment in large quantities made it possible to mobilize entire populations for military service. The concept of total war, in which entire societies were organized for military purposes, became feasible with industrial technology. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants became blurred as industrial workers became essential to military success. The environmental impact of industrial warfare was severe. The massive consumption of natural resources required for military production depleted forests, mines, and other natural resources. The pollution generated by military industries created environmental damage that was often permanent. The destruction caused by industrial weapons was far greater than anything previously seen in warfare. The psychological impact of industrial warfare was significant. The mechanical, impersonal nature of industrial combat was profoundly different from the personal, individual combat of previous eras. The enormous casualty rates made possible by industrial weapons created new forms of psychological trauma that military medicine was only beginning to understand. The concept of shell shock and combat fatigue emerged from the recognition that the human mind cannot always cope with the stress of industrial warfare. The question that emerges from this examination of industrial warfare technology is both technical and human. How did the mechanization and industrialization of warfare affect the experience of individual soldiers and the nature of combat itself? And what were the long-term consequences of making human beings mere components in an industrial system of violence? The earth trembles beneath your feet as thousands of artillery pieces unleash a coordinated bombardment that can be heard 50 miles away. The year is 1916, and you stand in a communication trench near the Somme, witnessing the ultimate expression of industrial warfare, a battle in which the accumulated technological advances of a century are focused on a few square miles of French countryside. The mechanical precision of the artillery barrage, the endless columns of standardized equipment, and the vast logistical apparatus that supports this effort represent the complete transformation of warfare from a human activity to an industrial process. The mechanization of warfare brought about by industrialization reached its terrible culmination in the First World War, conflict that demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of applying industrial methods to military problems. The ability to produce weapons, ammunition, and equipment in unprecedented quantities made possible battles of a scale and intensity that had never been seen before. However, the human and economic costs of such warfare raised fundamental questions about the sustainability of industrial military systems. The daily life of a soldier in this industrialized conflict was dominated by the products of mass production. His rifle, ammunition, helmet, gas mask, and every other piece of equipment had been manufactured in vast factories using standardized processes. The food he ate came from industrial production systems, preserved in cans and packages that allowed for long-term storage and mass distribution. Even his medical care relied on industrially produced pharmaceuticals and medical supplies that were distributed through systematic supply chains. The artillery systems that dominated this conflict were marvels of industrial engineering. The heavy guns that fired around the clock required precision manufacturing to achieve the accuracy and reliability necessary for effective use. The shells they fired were produced in vast quantities using industrial methods that ensured consistent quality and performance. The logistics of supplying ammunition to these weapons required railroad systems, specialized transportation equipment, and vast storage facilities that represented a complete industrialization of military supply. The chemical weapons that characterized this conflict were products of the advanced chemical industry that had developed during the 19th century. The production of chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas required sophisticated industrial facilities and technical expertise that only the most advanced industrial nations possessed. The development of gas masks and protective equipment represented another application of industrial methods to military problems, creating a technological arms race between offensive and defensive capabilities. The aircraft that made their first appearance in military service during this period represented the application of cutting-edge industrial technology to warfare. The mass production of aircraft engines, airframes, and related equipment required new forms of industrial organization and technical expertise. The rapid pace of technological development in aviation was driven by military needs and demonstrated the potential for industrial research and development to accelerate technological progress. The tank, which made its debut during this conflict, represented a revolutionary application of industrial technology to the problem of mobile warfare. The combination of internal combustion engines, armor plating, and tracked propulsion systems created a weapon that could overcome the defensive advantages that had dominated earlier phases of the war. The industrial production of tanks required new forms of manufacturing capability and represented a significant technological achievement. The communication systems that enabled the coordination of these vast military forces were products of the electrical industry that had emerged during the late 19th century. Telephone and radio communications made possible the real-time coordination of artillery fire, infantry movements, and logistics operations across entire fronts. The development of encryption and code systems represented early applications of systematic approaches to information security. The medical systems that attempted to cope with the enormous casualty rates of industrial warfare were themselves industrialized. Field hospitals were organized like factories, with standardized procedures and specialized personnel for different types of treatment. The mass production of medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, and surgical instruments made possible medical care on a scale that would have been impossible using traditional methods. The logistics systems that supported these vast military operations were unprecedented in their scale and complexity. The transportation of millions of soldiers, vast quantities of equipment, and enormous amounts of supplies required the coordination of railroad networks, shipping systems, and motor transport on a scale that had never been attempted before. The management of these systems required new forms of administrative organization and planning that would influence civilian logistics for decades to come. The economic mobilization required for this conflict transformed entire national economies. The production of military equipment required the conversion of civilian industries to military purposes, the mobilization of previously unemployed labor, and the development of new forms of government economic planning. The financing of these efforts required unprecedented government borrowing and the development of new forms of fiscal policy. The social consequences of this total mobilization were profound. The recruitment of millions of soldiers required new forms of military organization and training. The employment of women in military production created new social roles and expectations. the propaganda efforts required to maintain public support. For the war effort represented early applications of mass communication techniques to political purposes. The environmental consequences of industrial warfare were severe and lasting. The enormous consumption of natural resources required for military production depleted forests, mines, and agricultural resources. The destruction caused by industrial weapons was far greater than anything previously seen, creating landscapes that remain scarred for decades. The chemical contamination from gas, weapons, and industrial production created environmental damage that persisted long after the conflict ended. The psychological trauma caused by industrial warfare was unprecedented. The mechanical, impersonal nature of industrial combat, combined with its enormous scale and intensity, created psychological casualties on a massive scale. The development of psychiatric medicine was accelerated by the need to understand and treat the mental health consequences of industrial warfare. The technological legacy of this conflict was enormous. The research and development efforts undertaken for military purposes accelerated technological progress in numerous fields. The organizational innovations developed for managing vast military enterprises influenced civilian industry and government administration. The engineering techniques developed for military construction and logistics found civilian applications in the post-war period. The political consequences of industrial warfare were equally significant. The enormous costs and casualties of the conflict led to the collapse of several governments and the transformation of political systems throughout Europe. The demonstration of the potential destructiveness of industrial warfare influenced international relations and military planning for decades to come. The question that emerges from this examination of the convergence of industry and total war is both practical and moral. What are the ultimate implications of organizing entire societies around the systematic application of industrial methods to warfare? And are there limits to the human and economic costs that can be sustained by such systems? The answer to this question would shape the development of military technology and international relations throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. As you witness the vast machinery of industrial warfare grinding across the European countryside, consuming lives and resources at an unprecedented rate, you cannot help but wonder whether humanity has created forms of organized violence that exceed its ability to control or sustain them. The question of whether the incredible productive capabilities unleashed by the Industrial Revolution can be harnessed for constructive rather than destructive purposes remains one of the most important challenges facing human civilization. The story of warfare's evolution from stone clubs to industrial killing machines is ultimately a story about human ingenuity and its consequences, a tale that continues to unfold in our own time as new technologies create both new possibilities and new dangers for the species that learned long ago to organize itself for violence.